It is 5 p.m., so I will go ahead and call this policy meeting to order. Could we please have roll call?
Let me just turn that on. Ready? Oh, one of those. This one. Okay. Okay. Amy Levy.
Here.
Spencer Anderson.
Present.
Maria Delgado.
Here.
Okay, the record shows all members are present with Maria Delgado virtual.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We will be removing policy 527, employee general conduct procedures. And the reason for that removal is there are complementary policies that we want to review as a group that are not available for this evening. So can I get approval of the agenda omitting item 2A?
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Perfect. So we have a motion by Board Member Anderson and a second by Board Member Delgado. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, the motion passes unanimously. Thank you so much. So that brings us to 1D, approval of the minutes, but the minutes are not attached. So if we could have a motion to postpone approval of our previous meeting minutes until our August meeting, please.
I move to
So moved.
postpone. Second.
All right, we have a motion by Board Member Delgado, seconded by Board Member Anderson. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, the motion carries unanimously. Thank you. So that brings us to policy for first reading. Since A was omitted, we will start with B, policy 531. And we do have a new attorney with us this evening. We are thankful for that. Could you just please introduce yourself?
My name is Lauren Barand. I'm also with Beulah Vedder, Buchem Lead. I work with Susan Love, who's been present in the past.
Perfect. Welcome, Attorney Baran, and Attorney Love will be joining us at our next meeting, but we're happy to have Attorney Baran with us this evening to assist. So we'll start with policy 531, professional educator positions. All right, Let me pull that up. Board members Delgado or Anderson, are there any questions, concerns, or adjustments that you have to this policy?
I do not.
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. So my only thing, in that first paragraph where it says job while being ADA compliant, could we go ahead and spell that out since it's not listed previous to that ADA abbreviation?
Yes, will do.
Perfect. And ADA stands for?
Americans with Disability Act.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then my only question on this that I wrote at the bottom is, what about non-educator job description audits? And the reason I asked this is under the note. It said job descriptions for professional educator positions are on file with the Department of Human Resources. And then previous in the policy, for those of you who are at home and don't have this pulled up, it says the superintendent or designee shall be responsible for developing and maintaining written job descriptions. I think those are pretty standard. There are certain requirements for professional educators with licensure, et cetera. But my concern is with non-educator job descriptions. Is there a practice of auditing those descriptions to make sure that the requirements that are listed or the preferred items that are listed are truly in line with the demands of the job and what's needed in order to be successful in that position. And the reason I ask that is that I just want us to be very intentional about not excluding candidates or candidate groups because we have a requirement or a preference that's not necessarily a requirement in order to do the job well. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, and absolutely, when we go through and post for any position, it's an opportune time to make adjustments, but on a regular basis, similar to our board policies, we should get into a habit of going through all of our job descriptions and making sure that we have them at least reviewed to make sure that we are staying current and that we are in compliance with the most accurate and up-to-date statutes and regulations and expectations that the board has for the district.
Perfect, I love that. And since that would be an administration duty and not a board purview duty, is that something that you would like to handle is it admin regs or admin SOPs? What's the official title for the set of documents?
Kind of the industry language is administrative regulations.
Okay. Would you like for that to be handled there?
Yes. Please.
Okay, perfect. All right, just writing myself a note. So we will be spelling out ADA's, Americans with Disabilities Act. Everything else doesn't seem like any other board members have questions or concerns. So could we have a motion to approve policy 531, professional educator positions, as amended?
So moved.
Second.
Perfect. There's a motion and a second for approval. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, I believe that was an aye from Board Member Delgado. If yes, this motion passes unanimously. If no, please correct me. All right.
That was an aye.
Perfect, thank you so much. So that moves us to policy 532.21, reimbursement for damage to personal property. Board members Delgado or Anderson, do either of you, thank you for projecting those on the screen, that's very helpful. Do either of you have questions or concerns about this policy?
The only question that I would have is who's actually making these appraisals on the damage that's done? I mean, just out of my own curiosity.
Right. And that's in line with the question that I put it down. Is there a guide that principals can use to ensure consistency when these decisions are made? Ms. Armstrong, please.
Typically, when we have situations where personal property has been damaged during the course of their work experience, they provide a receipt or a quote for what that cost will be. They come to the business office, and truly we just look for reasonable, we know what eyeglasses should cost. We know what a regular coat should look like. But we're also looking at what they lost. So if they lost or damaged, a designer coat, we're going to need to replace with a designer coat. They shouldn't take less of that. So we want to make sure that we're looking at that and working with the individual.
Perfect. Board Member Delgado, go ahead.
So just out of curiosity, how things get damaged? Are there any examples that you may provide of, how things may get damaged?
That is a wonderful question. Unfortunately, there are situations in a school environment where a student may become agitated or unable to control their physical presence. And I use the case a lot of our paraeducators that may have glasses broken in a special ed classroom, or something is happening as they're breaking up an incident between students, there are those opportunities. They are not often, but they do occur, and we see more of it in our special education classes and our student service.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. And the only thing that I had is in the second to the last line that starts with belonging to the staff member is a direct result. I'm thinking that should be as a direct result. So if we can switch that and then put a space there.
Yes.
If there are no other additions, is there a motion to approve Policy 532.21 for first reading, reimbursement for damage to personal property?
So
So moved.
second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on this motion? All right, hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any?
Aye.
Perfect, the motion passes unanimously. So that brings us to policy 532.3, professional educator leave and absence. Spoiler alert, what I believe may happen with this policy is that we flesh out all of our questions, but we may need to give the administration time to pull relevant documents, similar to with policy 527, before we officially move forward with it. And I think that'll become evident as we enter into the discussion. So this one is a little lengthy. Let's just take it in sections. So that first section, starting with professional educator members, may be granted leave and absence. And then there's a section that is crossed out, and it would end with in accordance with board policy as administered by the superintendent. And my only question to that section, since all policy is administered by the superintendent, and that's not consistent language throughout our policy, would that be considered redundant?
Yeah, certainly in the terms, as you described it, that the opening paragraph with the language that's been crossed out does seem redundant because, in fact, all policies, as you had stated, are approved by the board and then administered by the superintendent. The only piece that I would have a question of, and I would look to Attorney Brandt, is simply the heading of the policy being leaves and absences. Do we need to have that first half of that sentence at all?
I think it's there simply to summarize what the policy is going to cover. But if you think it is unnecessary, it maybe can be folded into that second sentence, the administration is directed, if the board would prefer.
And then I agree, Board Member Levy, that we can strike that first sentence and then start the policy with that second sentence.
Okay, so when you say second, the administration?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I had highlighted this, so I'll just read it out. It says, the administration is directed to establish administrative guidelines to facilitate policy implementation. One, I don't logistically know what that means. It sounds like it's referring to administrative regs.
Correct.
Okay.
So we change guidelines to regs.
And my question is that the case for all policy, that administration is establishing administrative regs to facilitate policy implementation, similar to policy is administered by the superintendent? Is that a given, or do you feel strongly that that needs to be stated in this policy? And my concern is it's not stated throughout other, you know what I mean? It's just for consistency. What's your feedback on that?
And I appreciate the question because certainly not every policy needs an administrative reg. In the fact that certain policies explicitly direct the establishment of administrative regs, is an indicator that this should not be something that is absent from administrative regs. It's basically a heads up that when you read this policy, there is going to be an administrative reg associated with this policy. So look for that, and in that, it will facilitate this implementation. So it helps to clarify and not leave anyone wondering.
No, that makes sense. I appreciate that clarification. So, and I haven't reviewed the administrative regs, but are they organized in a manner that we could cross-list it at the end of policy, similar to how we do with the employee handbook?
That is a very good question. I will dig in to see if we would cross-reference administrative regs, or if typically they would not be cross-referenced, and something like this would be the way to call attention to that. So I'll look for an answer.
Okay, and then my question that might help you in what that answer is, who views on a regular or somewhat regular basis admin regs? Is that just the administrators? Do teachers and other employee groups have access to employee regs so they can kind of make sure they're in line with the expectation? Who views those?
Anyone would be able to view administrative regulations, and they rest with the superintendent. So as discussed, as we move rules out of policy and into administrative regs, it will be my responsibility to go in and actually populate those administrative regs, because they've been in various spots in this district, and so now we're going to consolidate all of them into one location.
Perfect. I am happy to hear that. I would encourage cross-listing the admin regs the same way we do information that's in the handbook, because we want our policies to be efficient, but we also want them to be comprehensive. So hopefully we can merge those two things. All right, so we have covered that first. We've eliminated the first statement. We're going to begin the policy with the administration is directed to establish administrative regulations to facilitate policy implementation. So then, is everyone okay as far as comments and concerns before we move to the next section?
I'm okay with that.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we're reviewing policy 532.3, correct?
Right.
Which is professional educator leaves and absences. So my question is this only related, or is this policy only relatable to just professional educators, or is this policy related to all staff as a whole? Because if it's all staff as a whole, why do we only have like professional educators? Because I know we have, other type of staff. So I don't know if someone can answer that question for me, please.
Yep, great question. Dr. Kieser, is non-professional educator staff leave handled in a different document?
That is a great question, and indeed they're similar to our employee handbook. At a time in the past, there was a split between professional educators and support, and so there are similar policies that will be coming up that will address very similar topics, but from the standpoint of support personnel, paras, and so forth.
So let me just check in with the board, because I want to have an efficient use of our time. So for the same reason that we pulled policy 527, do you want to continue, again, great question, Board Member Delgado, continue with a review of policy 532.3, or wait until that can come paired with other policy that relates to leave and absences for additional employee groups? I could see a benefit to doing it either way, but I'm interested in your feedback.
I would actually prefer for the policies that are relatable to each other to be looked at, at the same time. Because I think that some of those policies might be able to be put together conjecturally so that we don't have so many different policies in one way or another. I mean, I think we can probably touch base on, the policy that is relatable to professional educator, but at the same time, within the same policy, apply the other policy for other staff members so that there's only one place where you're looking at if it's related to leaves and absences. I think it would be more proficient if we did it that way than having two different policies in two different sections that are relatable to the same topic that we're covering. That's just my thought.
No, thank you so much. Board Member Anderson, what's your feedback?
If we're looking for consistency, we should possibly delay it and wait until we can compare both of them at the same time.
All right. I am definitely open to that. Dr. Kieser, would you entertain? I just want to read to you my questions. I do not need a response today, but I am hoping to streamline when this policy comes as a cohort that some of these questions can already be addressed. So moving down to the section that says a staff member becomes sick with a pandemic disease, my question is required quarantine treated differently than if someone is sick? So this outlines if someone is out sick, they would go through their sick time, et cetera, and then may potentially end up with leave without pay. But let's say that someone needs to quarantine 3 times or quarantine once. Do I have to use my sick time while I'm quarantining? So that's my question. And then the same question as it relates to a child or other dependent. If my child is forced to quarantine and I am the primary caregiver, do I need to use my sick leave in order to cover that quarantine? And then my other thought is, if we are saying that, no, you don't have to use your sick time because you or a dependent has to quarantine, is there a requirement of testing? And the reason why I say that is, let's say that you are required to quarantine for 14 days or provide a negative COVID test. So if I or my child need to quarantine for 14 days, but if I get a test and that test is negative, I may only need to quarantine for 2 days. So we want to mitigate or shorten that required time out. But just personally, I don't think it's fair for people to have to use their sick time because they are quarantining in an effort to keep all of us safe. So just some things that I would love to be considered when we do officially review these as a group. And then my other question, which is kind of addressed in Policy 523.3 Rule 1, which I am assuming is the will of the committee to review the rule attached to this policy when we review the cohort of policies with respect to any leave or absence for all employee groups. But my question is, well, one, at the second to the last line, we need a space between must and use. And then my question is, what time increments is leave without pay available? So is that like extended? It has to be a week or more. Can you take that in 1 or 2 day increments? If we could provide some clarity to what time increments leave without pay is available, that would be helpful. So we'll go ahead and is there a motion to postpone policy 532.3 and policy 532.3 Rule 1 until we can review that cohort of policies that pertain to leave for all employee groups?
Sorry, can I interject
Yeah,
real quick
absolutely,
before? Could we separate those two out? Oh, and the only reason why is to the conversation about the employee regs, the Rule 1 is actually functioning as the administrative reg. So
Let me ask this.
Yep.
So when we met, it was either June 8th or June 22nd, because that same recommendation was listed, but we actually made the decision, it was for policy 526, personnel recs, was recommended to move to the employee handbook, and we decided to keep it in policy in an effort to have a comprehensive library. And I think that this rule would fall under the same policy, and I just want to be consistent the same way we did with policy 526. If there are reasons that you're opposed to that, we can definitely entertain that.
I'm not opposed to it. I know that we had been looking at the rules individually. In some rules, the recommendation from attorney level was to eliminate and make that administrative, and as a committee, we've done that. And other times, to your point, we have made the decision not to do that. So that was the only reason why I wanted to separate the two, just so that I could share that thought in terms of how this rule, as I read it, functions. I would take this and build the administrative reg using this as the template, and then adding any changes that would come about as a review of the policy, along with the similar policies side by side.
So let's do this. Are you comfortable with us postponing policies 532.2, 532.3, along with Rule 1 that's attached to that policy? And when we're able to review them as a group, if you feel very strongly that Rule 1 is clearly admin regs and should just be cross-listed, can we cross that bridge at that time?
Sure.
The reason that I currently am in support of keeping it there, because if we have the policy 532.3, I think the Rule 1 explains it and kind of gives detail. So I wouldn't want an employee to come and read this policy and then have to go somewhere else for the explanation. If the policy is there, I am currently of the mind that it's helpful for the explanation of the policy to be there as well in the form of a rule.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, good discussion. So is there a motion to postpone policy 532.3 and policy 532.3 Rule 1 until we can review all policies related to leave across employee groups together?
So moved.
So moved.
You two got a coordinate.
Second?
All right, perfect. We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Okay, hearing none. All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Excellent. The motion carries unanimously. Okay, so that brings us to policy 623, budget implementation.
Okay, so in these policies, as part of annual review process that Ms. Armstrong has been reviewing with me, we made some changes to 523, many of which are updates to titles. We noticed in terms of current terminology, so in number 2, the Wisconsin Uniform Financial Accounting Requirements is often used by the acronym WOFR, so we wanted to put that in there. And so it was language cleanup more than anything, and I'm looking at Ms. Armstrong to see if there was any additional information that she wanted to share before questions.
No, in the effort to hear the board and the community in wanting to understand acronyms that we're using, I wanted to make sure that we are referencing both the actual title and what would be referred to, because we always talk about DPI, and in my world, we talk about the woofer quite a bit. I think it's important to have those in there. And these are kind of similar to the conversation previously. These policies that we're addressing tonight as the annual review are all interconnected, and so I wanted to bring them all at one time just for a lot of them are just typographical overlays.
Perfect. No, board members Anderson or Delgado, do you have any questions or comments for this policy?
I do have to say thank you for like trying to make it easier for the outside public to be able to understand the acronyms and what kind of terminology is used.
I coincide with what board member Anderson states. I think it's important to keep that in mind, that when you're using acronyms, not all of us are like school, driven or, have anything to do with schools and acronyms. So I value that very much. And I'm not really good with acronyms, so I thank you, with my heart.
Perfect. Thank you, board members, for that feedback. My only question, okay, so policy 185.1 and throughout the 100 series, it kind of outlines the things that the board as a whole and board committees specifically should be doing. So in policy 185.1, one of the things that's highlighted is that the committee should study the plans on the development of the budget quarterly. And so I want us to make sure that, and this is kind of a separate conversation, kind of related, that we are abiding by the duties that are laid out for the board in policy. And the reason I bring that up with respect to this policy is in number 4, the second half of that, it says budget adjustments account that affect the bottom line of the budget total by fund and or change the functional purpose of the appropriations slated in the adopted budget shall be made only when authorized by a vote of 2/3 of the entire membership of the board as prescribed by law. So when it's time for us to do those quarterly budget reviews, if that, and I'm open to what it looks like, but if that's something, I don't want that to be missed. So I want it in some way to be highlighted to the board is this is one of your responsibilities as it relates to the budget. So technically it's not going to change anything in this policy, but I do want us to glean from policy what our requirements are as a board. And it, like I said, with policy 185.1, we should be prepared to review the budget quarterly. So not just in that big fall budget approval. So I want to make sure that we're doing that, which is not technically this committee, but when I report out on what things are highlighted in policy, I want to be able to pass that on to that chair. And then also to highlight about the 2/3 vote that is required. So my question to the administration is how do we capture those two things in a way that won't be missed? And my initial thought was, we have a master calendar and it includes all the statutory requirements for the board. Also, it has been helpful as a chair as I plan committee meetings of what things need to be covered in what month, that we use this policy to get a quarterly budget review on the board and know what is the requirement of certain types of votes. But if the administration feels there's a different way we can capture that, I am definitely open to hearing that.
I'll jump in just briefly to say we definitely are thinking along the same lines. We do have a Google Doc that is by month and by committee in each month so that we can populate those spots. The only thing we don't have in there, which is something for us to consider, is the type of vote needed for each item. And now I'll turn it over to Ms. Armstrong.
Thank you. Those were great insights. I do want to provide that our monthly financial report is that meets the requirements of the budget review because we are giving you the budget and the actuals. So we're actually going above and beyond when the board accepts those monthly financial reports. Instead of approving quarterly and doing that review, we are doing it a monthly review. So the board is seeing those budget reviews in those monthly reports. Now, if I know on the Finance, Business, and Operations Committee last night, we've approved a draft agenda calendar for the year, and that includes a semi-annual full budget state of the district in January that we'll be presenting at that point to give a year. Here we are halfway, and we'll do that. As far as the 2/3 vote, that is when we are doing budget adjustments that are required by board, and those are noticed in that manner that the board secretary has to have that 2/3 vote, so it can't be a 4-3 vote. That is what is required under passing those budget adjustments that Ms. Lapointe would provide to the district or to the board. Yeah, I don't know if there's more to it, but it's required it's by state statute. When we do any budget adjustments, we also have to publish those in the paper. So all of that of the 2/3 vote and everything is published through the paper to meet the resolution, the requirements of law.
Perfect. One, I did not realize that, so I appreciate that clarification, that there is a stopgap to make sure that the board is aware of the manner in which we need to vote for those budget adjustments. So thank you for that clarification. And two, when I read this, the quarterly, like I know we do monthly, but the fact that this said quarterly made me believe that it was something different that should be happening quarterly. So my next question is it worth clarifying that in policy? So with policy 185.1 talks about we need to do this quarterly, so everyone understands that that's the monthly obligation that business, finance, and operations currently meets. Or am I the only one that thought that was different?
No, I don't think you're the only one that thinks that it's different. What I want to point out in that our standpoint is for our credit rating and all of that, having monthly reports are more beneficial to the district in our reporting, that the board is looking at those. So the business office for the past, I will say at least 5 years, have reported monthly, although the requirement in one policy, it was previously only annually that we had to present you, the board, with that information. So when the policy was changed a while ago to quarterly, we always have the right to present that more often, but by policy, we're required to give that to you. I don't anticipate seeing a difference that we would change back to a quarterly, but I don't know if we need to change policy, if we want to mandate that, because it is not required. It is the choice that we have made to I hate to say that, but over-present it to you, so for the transparency and understanding of where we are in our budget.
No, I appreciate that. So Dr. Kieser, would it make sense in your estimation to include that in admin regs? So the requirement is quarterly, but we exceed that requirement by having a monthly report, and that way we won't have to fool around with changing or clarifying policy.
Yes, I can definitely put that in administrative regulations.
Okay, did I say employee regs?
Yes.
Thank you for gently correcting me. I appreciate that. All right, perfect. And then my other question, which may be a moot point, is towards the bottom when it says the business operations and finance, that correction there. It says the committee of the Board of Education shall periodically review the total budget operations too. And you know what? It is a moot point, because my question that I wrote down was, is there a reason that it's not specific, that vague language of periodically is written? But it sounds like Dr. Kieser is going to clarify that in admin regs, not employee regs, and we should be in good shape. So with all of that being said, I just want to check in with committee members. Are there any other questions or concerns on policy 623? If not, I would entertain a motion to move this on to the full board for first reading.
So moved.
Second?
All right, there is a motion and a second to approve policy 623 to the full board for first reading. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, the motion passes unanimously. Thank you. So that brings us to policy 652, revenues for investment. Mrs. Armstrong has not moved, so I am assuming that you have some input, so I yield the floor.
Okay, I wanted to make sure that Dr. Keyser didn't want to address those issues. This policy is coming before the committee simply as one that's referenced in other policies that are coming tonight. And I noticed some typographical issues in changing it from rate or return to rate of return, and compliance with instead of compliance will. They're very typographical issues. Number 3, kind of going with my previous comment, I wanted to identify what these acronyms stood for. So FDIC and NCUA, most individuals know that they see an FDIC sticker at the bank, but they don't know what it means. So I wanted to provide that clarity so people could understand that. And personal preference under number 4.1 and 4.2, I don't think that the use of district monies is appropriate language, so I wanted to change those to district funds. And again, it is referencing those acronyms which have now been identified up above. And then again, another just word change and correction from of to in the bottom.
Perfect. I agree with you with monies versus funds for what that is worth. Board members Delgado and Anderson, do you have any other corrections, concerns, or questions for policy 652?
Looks good to me.
I'm fine with it too.
All right, so I have a couple things, and I think this may go along with preference as well. If we start at the beginning, that second line towards the end, giving the fact that the district is acting as in the capacity, is that how we want that phrase? Could we just remove as?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, no problem. So we will remove as in that second line, and then when we have 1, 2, and 3 under that, could we use safety, semicolon, protecting the funds from risk and loss? So we name it and then use a semicolon to explain it. And then the same for liquidity, semicolon, ensuring that the investments meet the liquidity and expenditure needs of the district operations. And if that is acceptable, what I would recommend for 3 is putting competitive ROI, semicolon, return receiving a competitive rate of return on the chosen investment. So that way we have just consistent, you name it and then you explain it. And then also along the lines of uniformity, instead of having 1 through 11 and then under 11 starting with 1, could we use bullet points for that to segment that this is a subset of number 11? And then that would carry over under number 4, 6, and 12. And I'll give a moment so that can be recorded. And then, okay, so number 2 felt a little awkward to me. So adequate records of investments, transactions, and related reports and documents are maintained. Could we merge 2 and 3? So it would read, unless there's a reason not to, adequate records of investments, transactions, and related reports and documents will be maintained in accordance with the adopted records retention schedule. Are there any issues with merging 2 and 3?
At this point, I don't know of any reason I would object to that. I'm trying to think of any other possible type of record we would have.
Yeah, please.
And with this being revenues from investments on the policy, I offhand cannot think of other types of transactions that we would be recording and saying that the adequate records, that we're holding it with the adequate records retention schedule. I would like to defer to the attorney if she has a reason. I can't think of any offhand.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Attorney Baran, could you help us out with this one? And let me know if you need me to repeat anything. Oh, you're muted.
Can you repeat how you would propose merging them?
Yeah, absolutely. So in looking at number 2 and number 3, what I would recommend that we do, unless there's an issue, is adequate records of investments, transactions, and related reports and documents will be maintained in accordance with the adopted records retention schedule. So basically, I'm just eliminating are maintained and then records, because records is already used at the start of 2.
I don't believe there'd be a problem with that.
Okay, perfect. So we will merge 2 and 3. And then my question, hopefully there's something that I'm missing, but 4 through 7, aren't those implied? Records are received in a timely manner by designated personnel. Records are disposed of systematically and properly. Access to records is managed, and records can be found and relied upon. If it's not implied, I'm fine with keeping it, but I'm hoping it's implied.
I would agree that it should be implied, but I would like to keep those words in
Perfect.
there.
You paused, so that works. Could we, because it seems to me that 4, 5, 6, and 7 are exclusive to what is now the merger of 2 and 3. So since those aren't separate kind of issues, could we put those as bullet points under now number 2? So it'll be number 1, number 2, which is now number 2 and 3 merged, and then 4, 5, 6, and 7 will be bullet points of number 2. So number 8 would become number 3. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. And on the next page, I think I'm good. My only question is under number 13. Participants in the investment include, but may not be limited to, officials of the district, depository institutions, and custodial institutions. Since depository institutions and custodial institutions are outside of the purview of who the board directly supervises, because they're not an official of the district, I'm fine with leaving this in policy for consistency, but my assumption, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the information that's outlined in 13 would appear in any outside agreement that we have with a depository institution or a custodial institution. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is accurate. However, I'm thinking of the defeasance that the district is doing. And, that's sitting in an escrow account that we've had both Baird and Quarles and Brady legal group consulting and managing that. And then Associated Trust is actually the account that is managing and investing those funds. So I think by outlining this in this policy, there isn't a contract agreement with them we have our accounts set up with them, and they are our investment group. But I think that there may be indications where we've created a new relationship with like Capital. When we get to the other policy, you'll see the banks that we're doing business with. We don't sign agreements with every single one of them. So those agreements are coming from the investment agreement that we have. So I think this is letting the depository and the custodial institutions such as Baird and Associated Bank, knowing that these are expectations for all subcontractors underneath that.
So let me just clarify. So I get that our contract, we don't have the same level of written agreement with our subcontractors, which will be listed in an upcoming policy that we'll review this evening, as we do with our main contractor. But somewhere in that agreement with our main contractor is the sentiment that all participants in the investment process shall seek to act responsibility as custodians of the public trust participants. Everything that's outlined in 13, that is covered in some form in our agreements with them, correct?
I would believe so, but I would need to really go back and review those contracts.
Okay.
So I know that our contracts have been reviewed by legal, but they were pre my time.
Right.
So I don't feel comfortable giving you a definitive without looking at them.
No, I appreciate that. So Dr. Kieser, is that an acceptable expectation? Is that number 13 will be used to review contracts just to make sure that the information contained in 13, because I think it's great, I agree to all of it, but since these outside partners may never read our policy, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I do want to correct that thinking, and I appreciate you speaking out. All of during our audit process and all, when we do any updates to these policies, they are sent out to our investors. So they have a current copy of anyone listed in that policy we're going to look at here in a few minutes. This will be sent out with any updates when we revise policy. We have to send our investment policy to those depositories and custodial accounts, and they would then send it out to their subcontractors as well.
Okay, perfect. And the understanding is they agree to what is outlined in our policy as a prerequisite for working with us in this manner?
Yes.
Okay, then we're good. All right, perfect. And that ends. So I am looking for a motion to approve policy 652 for first reading to the full board.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, perfect. There is a motion and a second to approve policy 652 to the full board for first reading. Is there any discussion on this policy? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, the motion carries unanimously. Thank you. So that brings us to policy 661, depository of funds. Again, Mrs. Armstrong has not moved, so I will yield the floor.
Okay. Again, because the true nature of the policy that needed to definitely come to the board was the Rule 1 of Policy 661, I wanted to make sure that we had that reference point. I did notice in the second paragraph that it had stated in a concentrated effort, and I felt that should have been a concerted effort instead of concentrated. Added a clarification word of the, and then changed the titling. So it is truly just a overlay of what was already there.
Perfect. So is our committee members comfortable with us reviewing and approving policy 661 and 661 Rule 1 at the same time, so we can kind of have an open discussion of how those relate to each other?
That's just fine with me.
Okay, perfect. So my concern is that in policy 661, low battery. It says the Board of Education shall annually designate the primary depositories. Okay, so if we swing over to policy 661 Rule 1, this was last revised in January 22nd of 2013. So similar to making sure that we catch things that are board responsibilities, and I'm open to how this is tracked. My first thought would be in a master calendar format, that somewhere on that annual master calendar, there is review of policy 661 and 661 Rule 1, because I just want to make sure that if the policy says we're reviewing it annually, that that is happening. Okay,
Yes.
and thank you so much. Yep, okay, so that way I'm just reading my notes that I wrote on the policy to make sure I cover everything. The corrections on policy 661 look fine to me. Is there anything that we need to know about policy 661 Rule 1 now that we've established that we're going to put a mechanism in place to make sure this is reviewed annually.
And I appreciate that. I also do want to comment that this is something that we look at every year, and if there's no changes, it has not been brought forward to the board for changing. And I think that that was the problem with, it's not showing the reviewed dates, because if it's not coming to the board, but I did include that in kind of the preliminary calendar I had for next year. Or for the committee, I referenced when policy committees would coincide with the district, so we can add that to the master calendar. This is really a clarification, removing repetitive or renamed banks and depositories. So you will notice the first one, American Deposit Management Company, that is really replacing the Bay Lake Bank as custodian for the American Deposit Management Company. That is one in the same, and then they are no longer associated with Bay Lake Bank. Capital One was a new offering that was with our sub work with American Deposit Management Company. And then we have our OPEB trusts and things with Associated and Blackhawk Bank. The others, the National Bank and Trust and PMA and U.S. Bank Corp., those were all entities that we had debt issuances with. And when we paid off the debt issuance last year, we did not have those relationships any longer.
Perfect. Quick question. I appreciate kind of the merging, the replacement, why we don't need this anymore. And I know you do a really nice job in the financial reports of kind of giving notes for why things appear the way they appear. Is at least some of the information you just shared with us included in financial reporting? Like, this is what we no longer have an account here, and this is why, et cetera?
It is not,
Okay.
not in the monthly financial reports that we have.
So outside of a policy review, where, if at all, would that information about kind of like mergers or eliminations of account, where debt and assets are being held, is there a place where that would be captured?
In this policy review, that's really where it would be. And I can definitely, in the future, come in and have that explanation of why they're changing and what it is as part of this presentation.
Okay, perfect. So let's just plan that this is the place where that happens. And since we will be reviewing this annually now, because that's going to appear on the master calendar, I think it's a great place to get that clarification.
Yep.
All right. So I am open to a motion to approve both Policy 661 and 661 Rule 1 to the full board for first reading.
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone. We have had a very productive session. We got through all of the policies listed with the exception of Policy 527 and Policy 532.3 and 532.3 Rule 1, which will come back to us with their cohort so we can have a holistic review. That brings us to item 3, our meeting closing. Attorney Barand, I know we didn't call on you frequently, but we do appreciate your availability to work with us in case questions came up. So thank you again for joining us and for being available. Our next meeting date for policy, remember we are on a new schedule, so we meet on the first Wednesday of the month at 5 p.m. So our next meeting date will be August 4th. And that brings us to adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion and a second for adjournment. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, the motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. All right.
You have been removed from the call.
Well, that was efficient.
Goodbye.